Well, regardless of where one stands on the abortion issue itself, it is a fact that 34% of the electorate voted no in the 2018 referendum. And I don't think anyone hand on heart can say that these 1 in 3 voters are fairly represented in political life. In truth, they're grossly underrepresented in politics. And I think if you factor in all the people who want to see positive alternatives to abortion promoted, the number becomes much greater again than the 1 in 3 voters. There's little to be gained in constantly criticising the main political parties for not representing the views of a sizable proportion of the electorate. And I know that I personally look forward to a day in the future when the lives of everyone, born and unborn, are respected. I know that day won't be tomorrow or the next day, but it will hopefully happen much sooner than some people expect. And I would like to see a more inclusive society respectful of people's diverse views. But in the meantime, there is so much we can do, practically speaking. We can work for changes in public policy to ensure proper supports are put in place to meet the needs of women experiencing an unplanned pregnancy and to promote positive alternatives to abortion. It's vital, in fact, that we continue to intensify the pressure for practical changes. For example, there was the horrifying case reported last year in the Irish Examiner about a young woman in Ireland being locked in a room and forced to take the abortion pill. And more recently, research carried out by Savanta Comres for BBC Radio 4 revealed that 15% of women in the UK aged between 18 to 44 said that at some point in their lives they experienced pressure to have an abortion against their will. These are extremely troubling findings. As someone personally who campaigned on the no side in the 2018 referendum, I watched how the debate unfolded with great interest. There were many arguments for a yes vote, and they included terminations in the case of certain disabilities and in the case of life-limiting conditions for the fetus. Yet, in Ireland, there is inadequate support for women experiencing these issues. One of the arguments for the right to a termination was on the grounds of disability. Yes, a quick, easy solution. But one of the reasons I got involved in political life was to do more supporting people with disability. 20 years ago, I worked as a reporter on radio and in print, highlighting these issues. Sadly, the improvements in this area have been a long and drawn-out process. This is not good enough, and a termination is certainly not a solution when proper supports for carers are not in place. Parents are shouting out for school places for children with special needs on the spectrum, jumping hoops over the most basic essentials to raise their family with dignity. And so many areas, from employment to housing to public transport, sees those with disabilities at the bottom of the list consistently. Subsequent governments have failed parents and children alike for decades. And what is their solution? A termination if there's a sign of a disability. Sorry, but I just don't think that's good enough. And what about life? And what about life-limiting conditions? Yes, we've heard so many speak about unplanned pregnancies and the right to a termination. And yes, there have been some very heart-wrenching stories. Very little, however, has been said about those desperate to have children. And I know, because I was one of those people who struggled with fertility problems a number of years ago. The services and support in this country were appalling. This is something I've discussed with many women in the same situation, and so often they've spoken about life-limiting conditions. Yes, there are those who would willingly go full term. The referendum in 2018 was called a pro-choice referendum. But where is the choice for these women? We're all familiar with the political football, and there have been many, that is the National Maternity Hospital. All the grandstanding and politicking over whether members of religious orders should be or should not be on the board. Yet, in all the discussion and electioneering, not one single public representative raised the matter of a perinatal hospice. Those women who have received the devastating news that there is a life-limiting condition and want to go full term appear to have been ignored. A specialised unit within a hospital where they'll be treated with dignity and respect and supported all the way, because it is their choice to go full term with the pregnancy. This is the must. We cannot talk about human rights without considering freedom of conscience. One issue that was highlighted again during the 2018 referendum campaign was that of conscientious objectors in the medical profession. Their rights to refuse to participate in a procedure was to be upheld. Yet, shortly after the legislation was introduced, adverts appeared in the national press looking for medical professionals to work in public hospitals who would be compelled to carry out terminations if required. Within a short space of time, the government had already backtracked on its promise. We witness this time and time again in political life, where a number of high-profile politicians resigned from their parties following their refusal to toe the party line. Basically, our democratically elected representatives, voted by the people, and that includes the 1 in 3 who voted no, were forced to make a decision that was on the party manifesto or vote with their conscience. What is interesting is that many of those who did take a stance and sought re-election did hold their seats. During the referendum campaign in 2018, there were a number of human rights arguments raised. And I'd love to see the human rights argument applied to the current bill going through the houses of the Oireachtas. I am, of course, referring to the proposal to create a 100-metre exclusion zone around clinics, hospitals and GP practices. Think about this for a minute. 100 metres. First of all, what about an Irish citizen's right to freedom of assembly and freedom of religious expression? And I'm going to use an analogy here, if you can imagine this scenario. There are trials in a hospital for a new procedure or new type of drug, and it involved animal testing. And many people are outraged, particularly animal rights activists. They protest outside the grounds. People are on their way in. Some may be availing of the treatment and witness this. This form of protesting is permitted. Would I object to the right for them to air their views? No. Would I find it offensive to see posters, perhaps, of animals being treated cruelly in labs? Well, yes. But the government allows this kind of protesting. Similarly, if staff go on strike, or if there's any other kind of a dispute, gathering outside a hospital or clinic is still permitted. Except, of course, there's one exception. And at present, new legislation is being drafted regarding exclusion zones around hospitals, clinic and GP practices for citizens with a pro-life view. We're told this is to prevent potential harassment of patients availing of health services. But let's be clear, harassment is at present, in this country, is a criminal offence, as is disorderly behaviour in public. So why, oh why, do our public representatives insist on bringing in new legislation? This 100-metre exclusion zone could include community centres, places of worship, and more, since it includes GP practices, many in the centre of small towns and suburbs. In all reality, are we expected to refrain from publicising an issue that 1/3 of the electorate agreed with back in 2018? And what about enforcement? And what about enforcement? Our Gardaí are under-resourced at present. Crime is on the rise. Where will the resources come from to police this? And what about prosecutions? Let's say that someone is organising a pro-life meeting in a church hall about 90 metres from a GP practice. Once this legislation is enforced, will they be charged with a criminal offence? Last week, we witnessed the first ever criminal barrister strike. Again, another profession under-resourced and underfunded. There's a backlog in our courts, and we're still waiting for new judges to be appointed. And now this new proposed legislation will put an even further strain on an already stretched justice system. Only last week, the next stage of this legislation was going through the Dáil. Some party members asked for a freedom of conscience vote on the introduction of exclusion zones, but were refused. So much for a democratic country. So, in conclusion, I think there's a lot of good things we can do at a social and practical level. And I'd just like to end by saying, let's be the change we want to see. Make your voice heard, and let's create the future together. Go to Míle Maith.